At 6:23 a.m. on January 18, 1943, Staff Sergeant Thaddeus "Tad" Brennan crouched behind a makeshift sandbag wall at Henderson Field, Guadalcanal, listening to Private Wesley Caldwell scream for a medic 50 yards away. Caldwell had been shot through the chest by a Japanese sniper hiding somewhere in the dense jungle canopy beyond the perimeter. It was the 19th American to fall in 5 days to an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't find, and couldn't fight back against using standard military doctrine. Brennan's hands tightened around his Remington Model 721, the toy rifle his commanding officers had mocked for 6 weeks since he'd unpacked it from a Sears catalog shipping crate. The hunting rifle weighed 8 pounds with its civilian Weaver K4 scope, chambered in .270 Winchester with ammunition he'd bought with his own money. Every other man in the 147th Infantry Regiment carried an M1903 Springfield, with military iron sights or crude, low-power scopes that couldn't resolve targets beyond 200 yards in jungle conditions. Captain Morrison had called Brennan's rifle deer hunting equipment and ordered him to use real military weapons. The official doctrine was clear. Sniping was a luxury, not a necessity. American infantry advanced with overwhelming firepower, not precision shooting, but doctrine wasn't stopping the hemorrhaging. Or hedging. 11 Japanese snipers had turned the jungle around Henderson Field into a killing ground where Marines and soldiers died fetching water, delivering messages, or simply moving between positions during daylight hours. Caldwell's screams stopped. The sudden silence hit harder than the sound had. Brennan had grown up in the Maine woods, learned to hunt deer, bear, and moose from his grandfather who'd been a Union sharpshooter at Gettysburg. He understood something his officers didn't. In these trees, the difference between hitting your target and missing wasn't firepower. It was knowing how to read wind through leaves, how to spot unnatural shapes in natural camouflage, and how to put a bullet exactly where it needed to go with one shot. That difference was about to change everything. The humid air hung heavy with the smell of cordite and rotting vegetation. Brennan watched 2 medics sprint toward Caldwell's position, their Red Cross armbands stark white against the olive-drab chaos of the morning. One of them made it. The other dropped face first into the mud, a perfect headshot from somewhere in the canopy. The surviving medic dragged both bodies back behind the line, Caldwell's blood leaving a crimson trail in the volcanic sand. Where in the world are you watching this story unfold? Drop a comment and tell us your country. We love seeing our global community come together around these forgotten heroes. Captain Edgar Morrison emerged from the command bunker, his uniform crisp despite the tropical heat, his West Point ring catching the filtered sunlight. At 34, Morrison carried himself with the rigid confidence of a man who'd never questioned whether his training might be wrong. He surveyed the scene with clinical detachment, already forming the report he'd send up the chain. Another failure to follow proper movement protocols, Morrison announced to the assembled NCOs. Caldwell moved during daylight without adequate cover. Davies yesterday moved predictably. Mills failed to vary his route. These casualties are preventable if men follow doctrine. Master Sergeant Floyd Hutchins, a grizzled veteran whose weathered face told stories of trenches in France 25 years earlier, stepped forward. Captain, with respect, we've lost 19 men in 5 days. Maybe the doctrine needs adjusting. Morrison's eyes hardened. The doctrine is sound, Sergeant. It's been developed by the finest military minds in the world. What needs adjusting is the discipline of soldiers who think they know better than their training. Brennan kept his mouth shut, but his grip tightened on the Remington. He'd watched Morrison dismiss every practical suggestion over the past 6 weeks. When Corporal Davies had suggested moving at dawn instead of midday, Morrison had lectured about maintaining operational schedules. When Sergeant Mills had proposed varying patrol routes, Morrison had cited the importance of systematic coverage. When Brennan had mentioned his grandfather's sniper techniques from the Civil War, Morrison had laughed. Your grandfather shot at men standing in open fields, Sergeant Brennan. This is modern warfare. The morning briefing continued with the mechanical precision Morrison demanded. Patrol routes were assigned with mathematical efficiency. Supply runs were scheduled at regulation intervals. Guard rotations followed the manual exactly. Every decision reflected the institutional wisdom of the United States Army, refined through decades of professional military education. And none of it addressed the fundamental problem. Somewhere in the jungle canopy, 11 Japanese snipers were systematically killing Americans with weapons and tactics specifically designed for this environment, while the Americans responded with European theater doctrine that left them helpless. Brennan had been trying to explain this for weeks. He'd grown up stalking white-tailed deer through Maine forests, so dense you couldn't see 30 feet in any direction. His grandfather, Ezra Brennan, had learned his trade putting Confederate officers down at 500 yards during the siege of Petersburg. The old man had taught young Tad to read wind by watching grass bend, to spot camouflaged game by looking for lines that didn't belong in nature, to make every shot count because wounded animals disappeared into cover you'd never penetrate. But the Army had different ideas about what constituted proper training. The 1943 U.S. Army sniper doctrine had been developed for the anticipated European theater based on World War I experiences updated with modern equipment. Long-range shooting from prepared positions. Heavy rifles designed for maximum accuracy at extreme distances. Formal training that emphasized mathematical precision over fieldcraft. It was exactly what you'd need to hit German officers at 800 yards across French wheat fields. In the Pacific jungle, where visibility rarely exceeded 100 yards and camouflage meant the difference between life and death, it was worse than useless. It was deadly. Private Wesley Caldwell had been Brennan's closest friend in the unit. 20 years old, from a farm outside Cedar Rapids, Iowa, Caldwell possessed the easy optimism of someone who'd never seen real cruelty. He'd spent their ocean crossing talking about the girl back home, showing pictures, planning the farm he'd buy after the war. Yesterday, he'd asked Brennan to be his best man. This morning, Caldwell's body lay under a canvas tarp, another casualty of institutional inflexibility. Brennan had tried the official channels. 3 weeks ago, he'd approached Morrison with a detailed proposal for adapting sniper tactics to jungle conditions. He'd outlined how civilian hunting techniques could be modified for military application. He'd explained the advantages of lighter rifles with superior optics for close-range precision work. He'd even offered to demonstrate the capabilities of hunting equipment versus military standard issue. Morrison had listened with the patronizing attention of a professor dealing with an undergraduate who'd missed the point of the lecture. "Sergeant Brennan, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but military doctrine exists for good reasons. Your hunting rifle might be adequate for shooting deer, but we're fighting trained enemy soldiers. We need weapons and tactics that have been tested in combat, not sporting goods from a catalog." The dismissal had been absolute. Morrison had filed Brennan's proposal under non-standard equipment requests and forgotten it existed. When Brennan had raised the issue again after Davies died, Morrison had been less patient. "Sergeant, you seem to be having difficulty accepting military authority. Perhaps you'd prefer to return to civilian life and hunt deer instead of serving your country?" The threat had been clear. Push this issue further and face disciplinary action for insubordination. Brennan had backed down, but the deaths had continued. Davies, then Mills, then Rodriguez, then Patterson. Each casualty report carried the same conclusion: failure to follow proper movement protocols. Never inadequate equipment for environmental conditions. Never doctrine inappropriate for terrain and enemy tactics. The Japanese weren't following American doctrine, they were following common sense. Lieutenant Saburo Tanaka commanded the sniper section that had turned Henderson Field's perimeter into a shooting gallery. Tanaka had spent 5 years hunting in Hokkaido before the war, stalking brown bears through forests that prepared him perfectly for Guadalcanal's jungle environment. His 11 snipers carried lightweight Arisaka rifles with excellent optics, specifically chosen for close-range precision in limited visibility conditions. More importantly, they understood that successful hunting, whether the prey was deer or soldiers, required thinking like the quarry. American soldiers moved predictably because their doctrine demanded predictability. They used the same routes because efficiency required standardization. They operated during daylight because the manual specified daylight operations. Tanaka's men positioned themselves accordingly. They studied American patterns for days before taking their first shots. They chose hides that offered maximum concealment with multiple escape routes. They fired once and relocated immediately, following principles any experienced hunter would recognize instantly. The Americans responded exactly as doctrine dictated. They increased security patrols, following prescribed patterns that made them easier to track. They established overwatch positions at locations specified in the manual, positions Japanese scouts identified within hours. They called in artillery strikes on suspected sniper locations, hitting empty jungle after the shooters had long since relocated. It was a contest between institutional thinking and adaptive intelligence. The Japanese adapted. The Americans followed procedure. After the morning briefing, Brennan found Hutchins cleaning his M1 rifle behind the supply tent. The master sergeant's hands moved with the automatic precision of someone who'd been maintaining weapons for 26 years. But his face carried the exhaustion of a man watching his soldiers die for preventable reasons. "Floyd," Brennan said quietly. They'd dropped formal military courtesy when they were alone, a privilege earned through mutual respect. "How many more?" Hutchins didn't look up from his rifle. "How many more? How many more boys have to die before somebody admits the doctrine isn't working?" "Watch your mouth, Tad. That kind of talk gets you court-martialed. That kind of thinking gets people killed." Hutchins finally looked up, his gray eyes holding the weight of too many funerals. "You think I don't know that? You think I haven't been fighting this fight since France? But I'm a master sergeant, not a general. I follow orders and try to keep my men alive within the parameters I'm given. What if those parameters are wrong? Then we adapt as much as we can without getting ourselves relieved of duty. A dead NCO can't help anybody." Brennan understood the logic, but logic felt thin when you were burying friends. "That hunting rifle I brought, you've seen me shoot it? I've seen you put 5 rounds in a 3-inch group at 200 yards. Why? Military scopes can't resolve targets in jungle shadows beyond that range. My civilian scope has superior glass, better magnification. I can see things your equipment can't." Hutchins set down his rifle and looked directly at Brennan. "Are you suggesting your deer rifle is better than military equipment? For this environment, against this enemy?" "Yes." The admission hung between them like something dangerous. Hutchins had fought through the Argonne, had seen innovations emerge from desperation when official methods failed. He understood the difference between theoretical perfection and practical necessity. "What exactly are you proposing?" Before Brennan could answer, a rifle shot cracked through the humid air. Both men spun toward the sound, watching Corporal James Fletcher stumble out of the jungle, blood streaming from his left shoulder. Fletcher had been checking perimeter sensors, following the prescribed route Morrison had established. As the medics reached Fletcher, another shot dropped Private Anderson, who'd been running to help. The Japanese sniper had waited for the rescue response, knowing Americans would predictably rush to aid wounded comrades. It was textbook hunting. Wound the target, wait for the investigation, take the easier shot. Hutchins watched the scene with the flat expression of someone whose worst expectations were being fulfilled. When the medics had dragged both wounded men to safety, he turned back to Brennan. "What exactly are you proposing?" he repeated. "Let me test my equipment against the standard issue, tonight after dark, when Morrison can't interfere. If I can prove the hunting rifle outperforms military scopes in jungle conditions, maybe we can have a different conversation. And if Morrison finds out, then I get court-martialed for conducting unauthorized equipment tests, but maybe somebody else survives long enough to see tomorrow." Hutchins considered this for a long moment. Floyd Hutchins had joined the Army in 1917, believing in institutional wisdom and the necessity of following orders. 26 years later, he still believed in following orders. But he also believed in results, and the current results were unacceptable. "Tonight," he said finally, "after midnight, use the range behind the motor pool. I'll make sure you're not disturbed. And if I can prove what I'm saying, then we figure out how to save lives without ending careers." The day passed with a mechanical routine. Supply runs followed prescribed schedules. Patrols covered assigned routes. Guard rotations maintained regulation intervals. 2 more Americans died following proper procedures, and Morrison filed reports explaining how their failures to adhere to doctrine had caused their deaths. Brennan spent the afternoon studying his equipment with the intensity of someone whose life might depend on getting the details right. The Remington Model 721 represented the pinnacle of civilian rifle development in 1942. Remington had built it for serious hunters who needed accuracy at extended ranges in challenging conditions. The Weaver K4 scope provided 4-power magnification with glass that surpassed military optics in clarity and light transmission. More importantly, the entire system had been designed for hunters who got one shot at game that disappeared forever if that shot missed. Military doctrine assumed sustained fire from prepared positions with ammunition resupply readily available. Hunting required perfect accuracy under field conditions with no second chances. Brennan had bought the rifle and scope with money saved over 2 years of National Guard service, spending more than 3 months' pay for equipment he'd planned to use hunting deer in the Maine woods after his military obligation ended. When the attack on Pearl Harbor had extended everyone's service indefinitely, he'd shipped the rifle to the Pacific, thinking he might get opportunities to hunt wild game for fresh meat. He'd never imagined needing it to save his friends' lives. At 11:45 p.m., Brennan made his way through the darkened camp toward the improvised rifle range behind the motor pool. Henderson Field operated under blackout conditions after dark, but enough starlight filtered through the jungle canopy to navigate by. The range itself was a simple affair, sandbag shooting positions facing targets at measured distances, used primarily for rifle maintenance and zeroing. Hutchins was waiting with a selection of equipment, standard M1903 Springfields fitted with military telescopic sights, boxes of government ammunition, and a variety of targets. He'd also brought Corporal Davies's rifle. Davies wouldn't be needing it anymore. "Show me," Hutchins said simply. Brennan set up his Remington at the 100-yard line and peered through the Weaver scope. Even in the limited starlight, the 4-power magnification and superior optics provided a clear sight picture of the target. He adjusted for the slight crosswind and fired 5 rounds in rapid succession, working the bolt with the smooth precision of someone who'd been hunting since childhood. When they walked down range to examine the target, all 5 shots clustered within a 2-inch circle at dead center. "Not bad," Hutchins admitted, but Davies could do nearly that well with the Springfield. "At 100 yards in good light, yes. Let's try 200 in these conditions." They moved to the 200-yard line. Brennan adjusted his scope for the increased range and fired another 5-round group. This time, the shot spread to 3 inches, still centered perfectly. Hutchins picked up Davies's Springfield and attempted the same shot. The military scope couldn't provide sufficient resolution in the dim light to establish a clear sight picture. His shot scattered across a 6-inch circle, with one missing the target entirely. "Could be the scope, could be me," Hutchins said. "I'm not Davies." "Try 300. At 300 yards, the difference became dramatic. Brennan's hunting rifle consistently placed shots within a 4-inch circle. The military equipment couldn't reliably hit a man-sized target. In jungle conditions with filtered light and confusing shadows, the disparity would be even greater. "Holy cow," Hutchins muttered, examining the targets. "How much better?" In daylight, at extended range, through jungle canopy where you're trying to resolve a camouflage target against a natural background, maybe 3 times more effective, maybe 4. Hutchins understood implications the way only a veteran NCO could, which means instead of needing to get within spitting distance to guarantee a hit, you could engage at ranges where return fire becomes much less accurate. Exactly. And hunting teaches you to think like the prey. You learn to predict movement patterns, to understand how animals react to pressure, to position yourself where the target will be instead of where it is. Military sniping teaches you to hit targets at known ranges from prepared positions, which works fine when the enemy cooperates by standing still in open ground. These Japanese snipers aren't cooperating. Hutchins gathered the equipment with the efficient movements of someone reaching a decision. "Clean this up, store everything properly. Tomorrow morning, Morrison assigns patrol routes as usual, but maybe there's an equipment malfunction with your issued rifle. And if he notices I'm carrying non-standard equipment, then I guess we will find out whether saving lives matters more than following regulations." They walked back toward camp in comfortable silence, 2 professional soldiers who'd found a solution to an impossible problem. Neither man spoke about the potential consequences: court-martial for unauthorized equipment use, relief of duty for failure to follow regulations, disciplinary action for undermining military authority. But in the distance, they could hear Japanese voices calling softly through the jungle, coordinating positions for tomorrow's hunt. Tanaka's snipers were repositioning again, preparing new killing fields, while American doctrine demanded the same predictable responses that had failed for 6 weeks. Brennan cleaned his rifle with extra care that night, checking every component, adjusting the scope mounting, loading fresh ammunition. Tomorrow morning, he would discover that his issued Springfield had mysteriously developed a cracked stock overnight, clearly unsafe for combat use. He would reluctantly be forced to carry his hunting rifle as a temporary replacement, pending proper military equipment from the supply depot. Morrison would disapprove, but regulations were clear. A soldier could not be sent into combat with defective equipment. And if that temporary replacement happened to be more effective than the standard issue, well, that was just an unfortunate oversight in military procurement. As Brennan settled into his sleeping bag, listening to the night sounds of the jungle around Henderson Field, he thought about his grandfather's stories from Petersburg. The old man had learned his trade hunting Confederate officers who made the mistake of showing themselves at long range. 60 years later, the principles remained the same. Know your prey, understand their habits, position yourself where they'll be instead of where they are, and make the first shot count. Tomorrow, Tad Brennan will go hunting again. But this time, he'd be hunting the hunters. Dawn broke over Henderson Field with the mechanical precision of military routine. Reveille at 5:30 a.m., followed by chow, equipment inspection, and the morning briefing that would determine who lived and who died before sunset. Brennan stood in formation with the rest of his squad, his issued Springfield conspicuously absent from his shoulder. "Equipment malfunction, Sergeant?" Morrison's voice carried across the assembly area with the sharp edge of suspicion. "Cracked stock, sir. I discovered it during inspection. Unsafe for field use." Morrison approached with the measured steps of someone looking for insubordination. He examined Brennan's gear with clinical attention, noting the civilian hunting rifle slung across the sergeant's shoulder. The Remington Model 721 looked distinctly out of place among the regulation M1903, Springfields carried by every other soldier. "And you just happened to have a replacement available?" "Personal hunting rifle, sir. Shipped it from the States for recreational shooting when off duty. Manual state soldiers cannot enter combat with defective equipment." The regulation was clear, and Morrison knew it. A soldier with a damaged weapon had to carry whatever backup was available until proper replacement could be procured. That the backup happened to be superior civilian equipment was an unfortunate oversight in military logistics. "Fine, but I want that sporting rifle replaced with proper military equipment as soon as supply can provide it." "Of course, sir." Morrison continued down the line, assigning patrol routes with mathematical precision. The second squad would cover the northeastern perimeter. The third squad would check sensor lines along the river approach. Fourth squad would conduct a security sweep of the supply routes. Each assignment followed established doctrine. Each route covered territory specified in the operational manual. Each mission would expose American soldiers to Japanese snipers who had studied these patterns for weeks. Brennan found himself assigned to a routine perimeter patrol with Private First Class Tommy Anders and Corporal Mike Wilson, both solid soldiers who followed orders without question. Their mission was straightforward: check sensor lines, observe possible infiltration routes, report anything unusual. Standard patrol doctrine called for maintaining formation, following predetermined paths, and returning on schedule. It was exactly the kind of predictable movement that had gotten 19 Americans killed. As they prepared to move out, Hutchins approached with the casual manner of someone making small talk. "The weather looks good for hunting today," he said conversationally. "Might see some interesting game in the jungle." "Could be," Brennan replied. "Depends on whether you know where to look. Sometimes the best hunting happens when you go off the beaten path." The message was clear. Hutchins was giving him permission to deviate from standard patrol procedures if the situation warranted it. In military terms, it was carte blanche to operate independently. In practical terms, it was authorization to hunt Japanese snipers using methods the Army manual didn't recognize. The patrol moved out at 7:15 a.m., following the prescribed route through relatively open jungle toward the northeastern sensor line. Anders took point, Wilson covered the rear, and Brennan maintained overwatch from the center position. For the first 30 minutes, they encountered nothing more threatening than tropical humidity and the constant buzz of insects. Then Wilson spotted movement in the canopy ahead. "Contact, 11 o'clock high, approximately 150 yards, he whispered into his radio. Brennan raised his civilian scope and studied the indicated position. Through the Weaver optics, he could clearly see what had caught Wilson's attention. A slight discoloration in the natural foliage pattern, barely visible against the jungle background. It was the kind of detail that would be invisible to naked eye observation or military scopes at this range. "Japanese sniper, concealed position," Brennan confirmed quietly. "Arisaka rifle, excellent camouflage discipline, watching our approach route." Anders immediately reached for his radio to call in artillery support, following standard doctrine for sniper contact. Brennan caught his wrist. He'll be gone before the first round lands. These guys relocate immediately after being spotted. Then what do you suggest? Brennan studied the tactical situation with the analytical mind of someone who'd spent 15 years outsmarting prey that evolved to avoid human hunters. The Japanese sniper occupied an excellent position with multiple escape routes. He commanded the entire approach to the sensor line, making forward movement suicidal. Standard doctrine called for withdrawal and indirect fire support, which would eliminate the immediate threat while allowing the sniper to reposition somewhere equally dangerous. But hunting doctrine suggested a different approach. Anders, take Wilson and withdraw 50 yards. Make noise. Let him know you're pulling back. When he relocates to follow your movement, I'll have a shot at his new position. That's not in the manual. The manual gets people killed. This gets snipers dead. Anders looked uncertain, but Wilson had lost too many friends to enemy marksmen. What do you need us to do? Fall back talking. Let him hear you discussing withdrawal routes. Move slowly enough that he thinks you're following standard procedure. When he repositions to maintain observation, he'll expose himself for about 3 seconds. And if you miss? Then you call in that artillery strike and hope it works better than usual. Put yourself in Brennan's boots for a moment. You know you have the skill to save lives, but the system won't listen. What would you have done? Let us know in the comments. Anders and Wilson executed the maneuver with the precision of soldiers who understood that their survival depended on their partner's accuracy. They withdrew with convincing reluctance, discussing alternative routes in voices clearly audible to anyone within 200 yards. Their performance would have satisfied any patrol manual requirements for tactical withdrawal under enemy observation. The Japanese sniper followed the script exactly as Brennan had predicted. After watching the Americans retreat for 2 minutes, he began relocating to maintain visual contact. The movement was professional and careful, but it required him to shift position along a horizontal branch, exposing his silhouette against the sky for the few seconds necessary to reach his new hide. Brennan had positioned himself at an angle that would provide a clear shot during that transition. He'd studied the terrain, calculated the probable movement route, and positioned his rifle to intercept the target at the moment of maximum vulnerability. It was exactly the technique he'd used to take white-tailed deer in Maine, reading animal behavior and positioning accordingly. Remington spoke once at 7:47 a.m. The Japanese sniper dropped from the canopy without making a sound, his rifle clattering through the branches ahead of him. Both weapons hit the jungle floor within seconds of each other, marking the first successful American counter-sniper operation in 6 weeks. Anders stared at the fallen enemy with the expression of someone witnessing something impossible. Holy cow, you actually got him. Range approximately 180 yards, single-shot moving target, Wilson added with professional appreciation. That's seriously good shooting. But Brennan was already scanning the surrounding canopy through his scope. Japanese snipers operated in pairs or small teams, providing mutual support and security. The fallen marksman would have partners positioned to cover his withdrawal or provide suppressive fire if he was compromised. Standard hunting principles suggested there would be at least one more threat within 300 yards. He found the second sniper at 8:02 a.m., positioned in a palm tree 220 yards northeast of the first position. This one had better concealment discipline, virtually invisible against the natural background. Only the slight geometric irregularity of his rifle scope gave away his position to someone studying the area with high-quality optics. Second contact, 2 o'clock high, palm tree cluster, Brennan reported quietly. This shot was more challenging. The range was longer, the target partially concealed behind palm fronds, and the sniper was now aware that someone was hunting him. Brennan had to account for wind drift through the jungle canopy, the slight movement of vegetation, and the probability that his target would relocate the moment he detected movement in Brennan's position. The hunting solution was patience. Instead of rushing the shot, Brennan settled into a comfortable shooting position and waited. Eventually, the Japanese sniper would need to shift position to maintain observation of the American patrol. When he moved, he would expose enough of his silhouette for a precision shot. The wait lasted 11 minutes. When the sniper finally adjusted his position, Brennan was ready. The second shot dropped another experienced marksman from the canopy, his weapon following him to the jungle floor. 2 confirmed kills, Anders reported over the radio with barely concealed excitement. Sniper threat neutralized. But Brennan's hunting instincts were telling him the engagement wasn't finished. Two snipers positioning themselves to cover this particular approach suggested a larger operation. They had been positioned to support something more significant than random harassment fire. "We need to check the sensor line," he told Anders. "If they were covering this approach, there's probably a reason." They advanced cautiously through the area where 20 minutes earlier any movement would have meant certain death. The bodies of the Japanese snipers lay where they'd fallen, their equipment scattered among the vegetation. Professional soldiers, well-trained and properly equipped, who'd been eliminated because someone had finally applied appropriate tactics to counter their methods. The sensor line told the story. 3 electronic monitoring devices had been carefully disabled, their circuits cut with surgical precision. Japanese infiltrators had used the sniper screen to conduct reconnaissance on American defensive systems, mapping the detection network that protected Henderson Field's perimeter. "This was preparation for something bigger," Wilson observed, studying the sabotage. "They were mapping our sensors." "Probably planning a night infiltration," Anders agreed. "Good thing we caught them." Brennan understood the implications more clearly than his patrol partners. Lieutenant Tanaka's sniper section hadn't been conducting random harassment. They'd been supporting systematic intelligence gathering, using their marksmanship skills to cover reconnaissance operations that would enable larger attacks. The American casualties of the past 6 weeks hadn't been the objective. They'd been the byproduct of a more sophisticated operation, which meant there were probably more snipers positioned to cover other reconnaissance activities. When they returned to base 3 hours ahead of schedule, Morrison was waiting with questions that had the sharp edge of suspicion. "You eliminated 2 enemy snipers and discovered a reconnaissance operation? That's remarkably efficient for a routine patrol." "Lucky break, sir. Spotted movement, investigated, found more than we expected." "And you accomplished this with civilian hunting equipment?" "The scope provides better resolution in jungle conditions, sir. Enabled positive identification at ranges where military optics might have missed the targets." Morrison studied the intelligence they'd gathered. Japanese sniper positions mapped, reconnaissance objectives identified, enemy equipment captured. The tactical value was undeniable, but the methods violated everything he'd been taught about proper military procedure. "I'll need a detailed report on your tactics and equipment. The higher command will want to understand how this success was achieved." "Of course, sir." That evening, Brennan found himself surrounded by soldiers who wanted to understand what had happened. Word of the successful counter-sniper operation had spread through the camp with the speed that only military gossip could achieve. Men who'd been dying randomly for 6 weeks suddenly had evidence that the enemy could be defeated using methods nobody had considered. Hutchins approached with the satisfied expression of someone whose instincts had been validated. 2 confirmed kills, intelligence gathered, mission accomplished ahead of schedule. Not bad for a day's hunting. "It was the right tool for the job," Brennan replied simply. "Think you could teach others to do the same?" The question carried implications that went far beyond personal instruction. If civilian hunting techniques could be adapted to military application, other soldiers could learn to counter enemy snipers effectively. The casual slaughter of American personnel could be transformed into tactical advantage through application of appropriate skills. "Hunting is about understanding your prey," Brennan explained. "Learning their habits, predicting their behavior, positioning yourself where they'll be instead of where they are. Most of it isn't about shooting, it's about thinking." "And the shooting?" "The shooting is about making every round count. Hunters don't get to fire for effect or call in artillery support. You get one shot at a game that disappears forever if you miss, so you learn to make that shot perfect." More soldiers gathered as Brennan explained the principles he'd learned stalking deer through Maine forests, reading wind by watching vegetation move, identifying camouflage targets by looking for geometric shapes that didn't belong in natural environments, understanding animal behavior well enough to predict movement patterns. The techniques translated directly to counter-sniper operations, with one significant advantage. Japanese snipers were following tactical doctrine that made their behavior more predictable than wild game. They positioned themselves according to military logic, relocated using standard procedures, and operated within the constraints of organized unit discipline. A deer might move randomly in any direction when threatened. A military sniper would follow training that could be studied and countered. "Show us," said Corporal Patterson, who'd lost his best friend to enemy marksmen 2 weeks earlier. Over the next 3 days, Brennan conducted informal instruction for anyone interested in learning civilian hunting techniques adapted for military application. He couldn't provide hunting rifles for everyone, but he could teach soldiers to think like hunters instead of traditional infantry. The transformation was remarkable. Men who'd been passive targets for weeks began actively hunting their hunters. They studied Japanese sniper patterns, identified probable hide locations, and coordinated approaches that eliminated enemy advantages. Most importantly, they stopped following predictable routines that made them easy prey. Japanese casualties mounted accordingly. Tanaka's carefully positioned snipers found themselves outmaneuvered by Americans, who'd learned to think tactically instead of proceeding by manual. The psychological dynamic shifted from hunter and prey to mutual predation, with Americans increasingly holding the advantage. By January 22nd, 3 days after Brennan's first successful engagement, enemy sniper activity around Henderson Field had dropped by 60%. The remaining Japanese marksmen were operating with extreme caution, limiting their exposure and relocating constantly to avoid counter-hunter operations. Lieutenant Tanaka found himself facing a tactical situation he hadn't anticipated. His snipers were trained to exploit American predictability, but American behavior had become dangerously unpredictable. Soldiers who'd previously followed mathematical patrol routes were now moving with the irregular patterns of experienced hunters. Positions that had been safe observation posts were being identified and eliminated with precision that suggested professional counter-sniper training. Most concerning, the Americans were using equipment that outperformed standard military issues in jungle conditions. Tanaka's own intelligence gathering suggested that at least one American unit had access to civilian hunting rifles with superior optics. The tactical implications were serious enough to warrant immediate command attention. On January 24th, Tanaka received orders to withdraw his remaining snipers to positions 5 miles inland, abandoning the Henderson Field harassment mission that had been so successful for 6 weeks. American counter-sniper capability had evolved to the point where continued operations would result in unacceptable casualties for minimal tactical gain. The hunter had become the hunted. Colonel Jasper Whitmore noticed the statistical anomaly during his weekly casualty review. For 6 weeks, Henderson Field had lost an average of 3.2 soldiers daily to sniper fire. Beginning January 19th, sniper casualties had dropped to 0.4 per day, with most incidents involving long-range harassment rather than precision kills. Captain Morrison, I need an explanation for this dramatic improvement in force protection. Morrison found himself in the uncomfortable position of explaining success achieved through methods he'd opposed. Enhanced counter-sniper operations, sir. Improved tactics and equipment utilization. Elaborate on these improvements. Sergeant Brennan developed techniques based on civilian hunting experience. Applied to military operations, these methods proved effective against enemy snipers using standard infiltration tactics. Whitmore studied the casualty reports with the analytical mind of someone whose job required understanding tactical effectiveness. Civilian hunting experience. Brennan grew up hunting in Maine. His grandfather was a Civil War sharpshooter. When military doctrine proved inadequate for jungle conditions, Brennan adapted hunting techniques for counter-sniper operations. And you authorized this deviation from standard procedure? Morrison understood that his answer would determine whether he received commendation or court-martial. I authorized Sergeant Brennan to use whatever equipment and tactics were necessary to protect American lives. Results? 11 enemy snipers eliminated, 0 friendly casualties during counter-sniper operations, enemy harassment reduced by 80%. Whitmore set down the reports and looked directly at Morrison. Captain, I don't care if Sergeant Brennan learned his tactics from Apache Indians or Martians. If he can train others to achieve similar results, I want him teaching every sniper in the Pacific Theater. If you're still watching up to this point, you understand that real innovation often comes from the most unexpected places. Brennan's quiet rebellion saved countless lives and changed military doctrine forever. If this story of the underdog proving everyone wrong resonates with you, please leave a small rifle emoji in the comments to honor all the unsung innovators who dared to trust their instincts. The formal recognition came 3 weeks later. Brennan was promoted to first sergeant and assigned to establish a counter-sniper training program for the entire Guadalcanal theater. His curriculum would be based on civilian hunting principles, adapted for military application, with emphasis on fieldcraft, marksmanship, and tactical thinking. The program began with 12 volunteers drawn from units across Henderson Field. Men who'd watched friends die to enemy snipers and wanted the skills to fight back effectively. Brennan taught them to read jungle terrain the way Maine hunters read forest environments, to understand camouflage as a system of natural patterns that could be analyzed and defeated, to think like predators instead of prey. Most importantly, he taught them that every shot mattered. Military doctrine assumed ammunition abundance and the possibility of sustained fire. Hunting required perfect accuracy under field conditions with no second chances. In the woods back home, a wounded deer disappears into cover you'll never penetrate, Brennan explained to his first class. Miss your shot, and you go home empty-handed. Here, miss your shot, and the sniper relocates to a position where he can kill your friends. Same principle. Make every round count. The psychological transformation was as significant as the technical training. Soldiers who'd been terrorized by invisible enemies learned to hunt those enemies using superior tactics and equipment. The passive fear that had paralyzed American operations gave way to aggressive confidence based on proven capability. Within 6 weeks, units trained by Brennan showed a 340% improvement in counter-sniper effectiveness. Japanese marksmen who'd operated with near impunity found themselves facing Americans who could outshoot them at extended ranges and outthink them tactically. The success attracted attention from higher command. Pacific Theater headquarters requested detailed reports on Brennan's methods. Military intelligence wanted to understand how civilian hunting techniques had proven superior to formal sniper doctrine. The Army War College began studying whether similar adaptations might be useful in other theaters. But the most significant recognition came from an unexpected source. In March 1943, captured Japanese documents revealed that enemy commanders had designated Henderson Field as a high-risk sniper environment and recommended avoiding counter-sniper operations against American units trained in hunting warfare methods. The Japanese military had officially acknowledged that American civilians turned soldiers had developed tactics superior to their own professional sniper training. Brennan spent the remainder of 1943 teaching hunting techniques to military snipers throughout the Pacific Theater. His methods were incorporated into official doctrine, with civilian marksmanship principles adapted for military application. The transformation was so successful that by 1944, American counter-sniper capabilities exceeded Japanese sniper effectiveness in virtually every engagement. The institutional resistance that had nearly cost countless lives gradually gave way to pragmatic acceptance. Morrison, who'd initially opposed civilian methods as unprofessional, became one of Brennan's strongest advocates. Hutchins, who'd risked his career to enable the initial trials, was promoted to warrant officer and assigned to help develop Army-wide sniper training. Most significantly, the military began recognizing that innovation could emerge from unexpected sources. Soldiers with civilian skills were encouraged to adapt their knowledge for military application. The rigid doctrine that had proven so deadly in jungle conditions was modified to incorporate lessons learned from hunters, mechanics, engineers, and other specialists who understood their trades better than any manual could teach. When the war ended in August 1945, Tad Brennan held the rank of Master Sergeant and commanded the Pacific Theater Counter-Sniper School. His curriculum was being taught throughout the military. His techniques had been adopted by Allied forces worldwide, and his innovation was credited with saving an estimated 800 American lives. He returned to Maine in November 1945, declined a regular Army commission, and used his GI Bill benefits to expand his grandfather's hunting guide service into a full-scale wilderness lodge. The Brennan Lodge became known throughout New England for teaching hunting skills to novice sportsmen and providing guided trips for experienced hunters. Brennan rarely discussed his military service, even when guests recognized his name from newspaper articles about innovative sniper training. When pressed, he would explain that he'd done his job and came home, then change the subject to upcoming hunting seasons or wildlife management. The hunting rifles he'd carried through the Pacific were displayed in the lodge's main room, but without plaques or explanations. To most visitors, they looked like any other sporting rifles used for Maine deer hunting. Only occasionally would a veteran guest recognize the Remington Model 721 and ask quietly about its history. "Shoot a few deer with it," Brennan would reply. "Good rifle for the Maine woods." In 1964, a military historian named Dr. James Crawford was researching the development of American sniper doctrine when he discovered references to Sergeant B's hunting methods in classified Pacific Theater reports. Additional research led him to Brennan's Lodge, where he found the man whose innovations had revolutionized counter-sniper warfare. "I understand you developed techniques that became standard military doctrine," Crawford said during his interview. "Wasn't anything special," Brennan replied with characteristic understatement. "Just knew how to shoot deer, and it turns out men hide pretty much the same way." Crawford's research revealed that Brennan's adaptation of civilian hunting techniques had transformed American counter-sniper capability from defensive reaction to aggressive hunting. The statistical analysis was remarkable. Units trained in Brennan's methods achieved kill ratios exceeding 5-to-1 against enemy snipers, compared to less than 1-to-3 for traditionally trained units. "Do you have any regrets about your military service?" Brennan considered the question while cleaning one of his hunting rifles with the careful attention of someone whose life had once depended on weapon maintenance. "Lost some good friends who might have lived longer if people had been willing to listen sooner. But you can't change the past. You can only make sure the lessons get remembered." And what lessons would those be? Sometimes the best solutions come from places nobody expects. Sometimes the person who knows what to do isn't the person with the highest rank. Sometimes you have to trust your instincts even when the manual says you're wrong. Crawford published his findings in the Journal of Military History, crediting Brennan with innovations that had saved hundreds of lives and influenced sniper doctrine for subsequent conflicts. The article attracted attention from military historians worldwide, leading to additional research on how civilian skills could be adapted for military application. But the recognition that mattered most to Brennan came in annual letters from men who'd survived the war because they'd learned to hunt instead of just fight. Soldiers who'd returned home to families, who'd built lives, who'd raised children because someone had taught them to think like predators instead of prey. Tad Brennan died peacefully at his lodge in October 1978, surrounded by the Maine woods where he'd learned the skills that would eventually save so many lives. His obituary in the Bangor Daily News mentioned his distinguished military service and successful post-war business, but focused primarily on his contributions to Maine's hunting and conservation communities. The military significance of his innovations was noted in a single paragraph that most readers probably skipped. His funeral was attended by more than 200 people, including a dozen elderly men who'd traveled from across the country to honor someone who taught them to survive. They didn't speak during the service, but afterward they gathered at the lodge to share stories about a sergeant who'd refused to accept that good men had to die because bad doctrine couldn't adapt. One of them, a retired colonel named Patterson, delivered the closest thing to a eulogy Brennan would have wanted. "Tad taught us that real innovation comes from people who understand their work better than any book can teach. He saved lives because he trusted his judgment more than regulations. He changed military doctrine because he cared more about results than procedures. That's the kind of soldier this country needs, and the kind of man we should all try to be." Today, the techniques Brennan developed are still taught in military sniper schools worldwide. Modern counter-sniper doctrine emphasizes the hunting principles he adapted from civilian experience. Understanding prey behavior, positioning for advantage, achieving perfect accuracy with single shots. The psychological approach, thinking like a predator rather than reacting like prey, remains fundamental to special operations training. The Remington Model 721, that had eliminated 11 Japanese snipers in 4 days, sits in a display case at the National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Texas. The placard describes it as the civilian hunting rifle that revolutionized military sniper doctrine. But most visitors walk past without understanding they're looking at a weapon that changed the course of modern warfare. Tad Brennan proved that sometimes the best solutions come from the most unlikely places. If this forgotten story moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more untold military histories. These heroes deserve to be remembered. In the end, that's exactly what Tad Brennan would have wanted, to be remembered not as a hero, but as a hunter who'd applied his skills when they were needed most. A man who'd trusted his instincts over institutional wisdom, who'd refused to let good soldiers die for bad reasons, and who'd proven that innovation often comes from the most unexpected sources. The Maine woods where he'd learned to hunt still echo with the lessons he'd carried to war and brought home again. Sometimes the difference between life and death is knowing when to follow the manual and when to trust the wisdom that comes from understanding your craft better than any regulation can teach. Sometimes the person who can solve the problem isn't the person in charge. Sometimes the equipment that works isn't the equipment that's officially approved. Sometimes the tactics that save lives aren't the tactics that follow doctrine. And sometimes a man with a hunting rifle and the patience to use it properly can change the outcome of a war.